I'm Bernie Belvedere, Executive Director of ISMA and Senior Editor of its flagship publication, The Unpopulist. Let me get started to introduce today's panel. The panel is on post-liberal critiques, and it's a response to them. And it's sponsored by the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University. So I'll say a few words about the nature of the panel and our moderator and our panelists, and then I'll kick it over. A particular pitfall for major traditions, especially very dominant ones, is this. When your particular perspective or social configuration is on top, when it is the very air we breathe, it can lull us into forgetting that it needs perpetual defending. In the great battle for supremacy among political philosophies, there is no such thing as a once-for-all decisive victory. You and I can be absolutely convinced that liberal ideals are the only ones worth patterning a society after. But the moment we treat their superiority as a given, the moment we cease believing liberal ideals must be continually defended and articulated anew, is the moment illiberal ideologies gain a foothold. Our critics don't rest, so that means neither can we. Liberalism has never really enjoyed anything close to unanimous approval. Recently, though, it feels to many of us that challenges to it that have a kind of uncomfortably high measure of public support have proliferated in recent years. So-called post-liberal theories are not all the same. In fact, they're quite different oftentimes, but they share in common a conviction that the era of liberalism is over, that liberalism can no longer meet the needs of a rapidly changing world, if it ever could, and that those who maintain a commitment to liberal principles are in some important sense hopelessly naive about the nature of the world. It won't surprise you to discover that I think these critiques are deeply mistaken, and the panel agrees with that assessment. So will you join me in hearing from them what they understand the post-liberal challenge to be and what it is that these critiques get wrong? This panel on post-liberal critiques is moderated by Jacob Levy, who is Tomlinson Professor of Political Theory and coordinator of the research group on constitutional studies at McGill University. He's also a senior fellow at the Niskanen Center and was a distinguished fellow at the Institute for Humane Studies. He's the author of the books The Multiculturalism of Fear and Rationalism, Pluralism, and Freedom, both published by Oxford University Press. Jacob ran a piece with us at The Unpopulist a few days ago. When I promoted it online, I referred to him as a top-tier political theorist, which is what he is. In his role as a public commentator, he is scholarly without being forbidding, and I frequently find myself thinking, he's just made the best point out of anyone on this really thorny topic. And honest to God, his blue sky posts are at times sharper than other people's actual published work. So it's a treat to have him here. Let me tell you about the panel this morning and then hand the baton over to Jacob. It's a great honor to have with us Mark Lilla, Columbia University professor and author of several books that have significantly impacted the discourse. Like Jacob Levy, whose Rationalism, Pluralism, and Freedom low-key doubled as a history text, Mark's work is deeply conversant with and infused by the sweep of intellectual history. Mark's work has this almost polymathic quality to it, where he's seamlessly weaving together insights informed by history, political theory, philosophy, the social sciences, and many other fields and disciplines. His book, The Once and Future Liberal, remains one of my favorites. We also have with us this morning William Galston, who holds the Ezra K. Zika Chair in the Brookings Institution's Governance Studies program, where he's a senior fellow. It would honestly take me an hour to go through Bill's lists of accolades and accomplishments. He's been a professor, a dean, a director of public policy, a founder of a research organization, even a deputy assistant to a US president. I personally gain a lot every single time I hear Mona Charen's Bulwark podcast. And his book, Anti-Pluralism, The Populist Threat to Liberal Democracy, is like a foundational text for what animates our work at The Unpopulist. Really thrilled to have him here. But wait, there's more. We also have with us this morning author and podcaster extraordinaire, former Dispatch editor, New York Times columnist, and long-suffering Memphis Grizzlies fan, David French. I don't know that there exists a voice today better than David's at taking complicated legal questions and court rulings and analyzing and clarifying them in a way that leaves readers and listeners fully informed. David has spent years prominently defending liberal principles against post and anti-liberals, and he's paid a heavy price for it. This conference is a safe space for us to articulate a liberal vision, but David's done the same in settings much more hostile to liberalism, and we owe him a debt of gratitude for that. It's an unbelievable honor to have you all with us today. Jacob, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bernie. Thank you to ISMA and the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins. Thanks to everyone for making it out first thing in the morning. Two thoughts about Bernie's introductory comments. One is that if there's anything our three main panelists today are not and have never been, it is merely complacent or smug liberals. Bill and Mark, in their very different ways, have been worried and concerned liberals, and David has long been a substantively committed conservative with deep commitments to the procedures and institutions of a liberal society, someone interested in working out what it looks like on that boundary. There are, I think, interesting questions to pose to other people who might at one point in their lives have been more complacent about the substance of liberalism and to reflect on what they've learned. This isn't going to be that. This is going to be a set of conversations drawing on people's long reflections on their own partial concerns and partial disagreements with a really straightforward liberal platform. I'm very struck by the fact that we meet today not only a day or so after the National Conservatism Conference that is in some ways the dark shadow that ISMA is trying to shine a light in response to, but also potentially genuinely right now, at least on the morning when Viktor Orban and Donald Trump are scheduled to have a meeting at Mar-a-Lago. On the relationship between post-liberal ideas and the crisis of liberal politics around the world in the last 10 years. That conjunction strikes me as interesting. The National Conservatism Conference began as a way to try to fill the intellectual gap that was left when Donald Trump rose to the presidency without the support, and indeed very often against the opposition, of traditional movement conservative intellectuals. And without a strong intellectual theoretical agenda of his own, I think it's safe to say, and people sought to fill that vacuum, providing ideas and theories and complaints and opportunism that would support Trumpism, not only Trump. Orban's relationship to national conservatism has been somewhat different. He has been an active and engaged subsidizer, supporter, and elevator of that enterprise, and has sought to ally what he's doing substantively in politics with what they are doing in the intellectual space. I want to start this morning's conversation with two main questions about post-liberal theories and critiques. And one of them centers on exactly this relationship I've just been mentioning. What is the relationship between the crisis of liberal politics, especially over the last decade worldwide, and the development of new theoretical critiques of liberalism, not only non-liberal, but avowedly post-liberal, that is to say, in a way that differs from maybe an earlier generation of theories that simply proceeded along their own lines. The post-liberal critiques have oriented themselves around the existence of a notional global liberal order or of existing liberal societies and of liberal theories. What is the relationship between the crisis in the political world and the development of those ideas in the last 10 or so years? They might have arisen in parallel. They might have just proceeded independently in response to similar facts in the world, a similar crisis in liberal society or liberal ideas. It might be that what happened in politics has merely attracted or supported ideas. This can go any number of ways. There's the mere propagandist, there's the court flatterer, there's the rush to fill a vacuum. But there are cases that are more than that as well. There can be attempts to come to understand and rationalize what has happened in the political world. And there's the intellectual category that Mark Lilla has usefully given us of the tyrannophilic intellectual, who sees in the rise of a new kind of political power an opportunity to put forward ideas for that figure to implement. But it might also be that ideas themselves have helped to shape the political world, and that what we've seen develop by way of critiques of liberal society has independent force in politics. And I'm going to encourage our panelists to talk about those things. The other question with which I'd like to begin is simply on the relationship between this post-liberal school and more traditional critiques of liberal society, critiques of the sort that our panelists have been engaging with all through their careers. What is new? What is new that is also interesting? What is new that is also interesting and potentially true? Are there new intellectual challenges in post-liberalism that liberal theory or liberal society really must grapple with and engage with? And the answer might be no. It might be that all the interesting ground was already covered, and that what we're encountering in post-liberalism is merely an attempt to dress it up in new politically opportunistic or social media-friendly terms. But I suspect there's something more to be said than that, and I'm going to invite our panelists to speak to all of those things, too. I'd like to begin with Mark, given the existence of tyranophilia as an option and just the kind of reflection that Mark is engaged in on the relationship of ideas to power.
Right. Well, thanks. First, I'd like to thank Bernie for not introducing me as Vladimir Putin. And now I'll go on to answer Jacob's question. Before I begin, before I directly address the question, the time I've been spending recently with the post-liberals, I recently wrote a long piece in the New York Review of Books, not only about the usual suspects who have been writing, but also kind of the intellectual world, kind of petri dish in which all of these things are growing. And it's led me to think about the sort of standard historical narrative that relates World War I to the cultural developments afterwards. And it used to be in sort of standard intellectual histories. You'd read about the war itself breaking out in August. Suddenly everything in civilization seemed to have crumbled before everyone's eyes, and then the bodies start coming back. And after that crisis, there were intellectual reactions to that and responses. There were artistic ones, there were political ones. But over the past few decades, intellectual historians have been spending or focusing more attention on the atmosphere that had been created before the First World War. And the more you look at the period from the 1880s to 1914, the more you see the apocalyptic mood that followed on, seemed to follow on World War I, actually developing long and deeply in the 2.5 decades before. And you see that in the decadent movements in French literature and in French art. You see that in the eruption of interest in Nietzsche once his works were publicized by a famous, I think he's Dutch intellectual, who gives the first lectures on Nietzsche, I think in the 1890s. Kierkegaard's work is translated into German and then into other languages for the first time. And so you can see a kind of weather pattern developing before the First World War, which then teaches you that it was that prepared the interpretation of the war as a huge break in history. It was not that the war just was the break in history and everyone reacted, but that an atmosphere had been created. Now, I think we all too easily, and I'm as guilty of this as anyone, think about the relation of political ideas and political events in linear terms. An idea developed, got rooted in people's minds and fed into a political development, or the reverse, that something happened on the ground and that gave rise to ideas. And I think that was implicit in Jacob's task to us that he sent us, is to think about that relation. And I want to encourage us instead to pay attention to the kind of cultural weather. It's not that you can point directly from one book to one event or one event to one book, but rather little things contribute to the creation of an atmosphere, a weather pattern. There are sort of low pressure fronts that move in. There are, winds that blow in from a far coast, right? And there's the annual, El Nino. I mean, you can, if you want to think about the, just the metaphors of weather, they become much more helpful. And it should make us attentive to little things that are going on everywhere that you can't prove in a court of law have directly led to something. But if you follow political events long enough attentively, and here I'm going to play my old man's card, you know when it smells like it's going to rain. And that's why it's so important for people who study political ideas, and it's something totally missing in our education in political theory, and even in political history, to pay attention to cultural histories that sort of pick up on these little things. Well, it smells like rain. And if you think it's raining now, it may be raining a lot more in the future, right? And I think we're in a situation now where it's been an intellectual atmosphere that's been created on the right that has helped to frame certain things that are going on in the world in such a way that they lead to a concrete political reaction. The only new thing, I think, that the post-liberals have added, many of their critiques of the economy, of culture, of what's happened to community, if you just were to look at Patrick Deneen's first book, all of that you can find somewhere else. And Patrick there in the book doesn't pretend to be novel, right? But rather pulls these things together. What's new and different is the development of a melodramatic historical dramaturgy. That it's not just that certain things in modern society are affecting the family, they're affecting our morals and so on. Rather, we have a story to tell. And, one story used to be hanging around, the old Machiavelli to the present story. But once it moved to Catholic hands, Then we start seeing theological stories, right, that look back to the rise of nominalism in the Middle Ages, or look back to a break after Pope Gelasius I. And you can read all these different stories. And the effect of that dramaturgy is that it's given every young person who kind of leans right and is unhappy with the present to pull out the little story and tell you why he's feeling or she's feeling so bad, right? And I don't know how many of you are in this position, if you're teachers, of being lectured by an 18-year-old who is just getting over acne about the good old days. And, you know, I try to bite my tongue and I listen. And they have to be treated gently to be gotten out of this. But one effect, and I'll stop there, of this dramaturgy, is the assumption that historical ages are defined by a key idea. And so there's this thing called modernity. That's not just a concept that allows us to sort out things, you know, things in the past that were different, had fundamental presuppositions that are different from today, but that there is this thing that has come over the horizon, right? And such that I find young people talking about their, you know, what's some event or some development shows what's wrong with liberalism. And a young person was speaking to me yesterday at one of the cocktail parties saying that, you know, understandably, people are disturbed by liberalism. And then I'm thinking, well, what particular things? And we start talking. And it turns out a lot of these things were just life, just things in life that happen and things that happen in history. But if they're convinced that we live in liberalism, then everything within that happens they relate in their mind to this thing, liberalism, and put within this historical dramaturgy, right? And so you have a stock answer to everything. And it reminded me of the old Jewish joke about a young man who always wanted to, a young Jewish man who always wanted to be a broadcaster. And he finally gets an interview. And he goes off to the interview, and he comes home, and his brother is waiting for him. And his brother said, "So, did you get the job?" And he shakes his head. And he said, "That's outrageous," the brother says. "Why not?" And the young man says, "Anti-Semitism." And it's a little bit like today, the answer to everything is liberalism is what's to blame for everything. And so I'll stop now. I know David has touched on this in his writing about young men, but I would like to put on the table some thinking about the weather we're in and young people today. So I'll stop there.
I'm tempted to go right to David, partly because the image of the self-righteous, angry young man one at a time raises questions about what it's like to deal with 10,000 of them at a time on social media. But I'm going to stick with my original plan of first moving to Bill and continuing the conversation about power and ideas. Bill's been, more than I'm reasonably sure anyone else in the room, more than anyone else I know, involved in his life in the bridging and moving back and forth. In a previous, much more optimistic for liberalism moment, Bill was involved in the interaction between what was happening in political theory and what was happening in the world of politics. And he got to see what it was that people on both sides were doing and were looking for in the interaction. He's written about that part. I'm not asking him to talk about his autobiography, but asking him to draw on his experience to reflect on the current moment about what ideas and politics are doing with each other.
Well, thanks so much, Jacob, for teeing up an excellent question, which I won't just use as a jumping off point, but will reflect on for a little bit before I use it as a jumping off point. I think it's important to ask ourselves what kind of conversation we're having. not only in this room, but also in the country and to some extent throughout the world. And my first thought is this. The reason that people in countries as diverse as the United States, France, Hungary, India, and many others that I could name, the reasons that they have gravitated towards anti-liberal leaders, I think, have rather less to do with post-liberal principles than we would like to believe. There are certain theories about the relationship between political ideas and political practice that are self-flattering to people like us in the sense that they put us at the center of the action. Yeah. And I guess I would plead for a little bit of decentering. Let me put it this way. Like every form of government, ordinary people judged liberal democracy much more by its fruits than by its roots. They may believe in the principles, but those principles are going to be measured against what a form of government at a particular time actually does for them. And if you ask most people, I think David and I were talking about this, if you ask most people, well, what are they looking for from a second Trump term? They will say things like, well, there weren't any new wars when Trump was president, and he finished some old ones, and we'd like to go back to that. We'd like to go back to a time of low inflation and rapid income gains, both of which occurred during the Trump administration. We'd like to go back to a period that to us seemed stable, although perhaps to others did not. They want to feel secure in their lives, in their communities, and in their understanding of themselves and their place in the country. And I would argue that it's the failure of liberal democracies to deliver the fruits that people have grown to expect that created an opening for post-liberal theories and leaders. Now, I'm going to think a little bit, out loud about what some of those things are, but I would stress some permanencies that aren't just rooted in the moment. I went to the National Conservatism Convention, and what I saw was a sea of young people. Speakers weren't young, the audience was. What was that all about? Well, the new is exciting. Dissent can feel like a form of bravery, right? We are the establishment. We may not want to think of ourselves that way, but we are. And there are particular joys of going against something that's established, particularly if you're young. You have things to gain and not much to lose. So that's permanency number one. Here's permanency number two. And I've been writing about this lately. Liberalism in its institutional arrangements is above all an effort to create, untoppable seawalls against tyranny. The Constitution of the United States is the greatest anti-tyranny document, I believe, ever written as a practical prescription for a society. But resisting tyranny is not the same thing as eradicating St. Augustine's libido dominandi from the souls of men. And as Abraham Lincoln warned us in his youthful Lyceum address, the tribe of the eagle is coeval with humanity. Right? There are people who are not going to be satisfied with an ordinary existence or even with a piece of power. They want it all. And people who want all of the power in their own hands are going to oppose liberal governance, root and branch, because it is the strongest opponent. Permanency number 3. I have been rereading the Declaration of Independence with a passion. And I'm noticing things that I didn't notice before. Everybody remembers the second part of the Declaration, Thomas Jefferson's finest hour. But if you look at the way it begins with the idea of separate and distinct peoples. What is the relationship between a separate and distinct people on the one hand and the universal principles of the Declaration on the other? And a balance has to be struck between universalism and particularism. And I think a lot of people have come to feel that liberals have disrupted that balance in favor of universalism, so that we are no longer able to offer a principled defense that we believe in of national borders and the need to secure them. Right? But core to an idea of democracy, liberal democracy as well as democracy, is the idea of the right of the people to constitute the demos. And so when Donald Trump says, if you don't have borders, you don't have a country, you know what? He's right. And we have to take that on board. Finally, we have to accept the fact, if we want to make a deep defense of liberalism, we have to take the deepest criticisms of liberalism on board. Another feature of the Declaration of Independence that's jumped out at me more than ever is the simple phrase, we hold these truths to be self-evident. That is a strength, but also a weakness. If you hold things to be self-evident, you may forget the arguments in favor of them. You may forget the fact that the invocation of human equality stands in some tension with observable natural differences. You may tend to forget the fact that liberty, taken to an extreme, can give rise to license. You may be tempted to forget the fact that a society based on individual rights cannot long endure without some sense of responsibilities to the community. You can't forget the fact that while we liberals root the legitimacy of the government in the consent of the people, that others will equally sincerely say that all legitimate authority flows from God. And that is a permanent, that's a permanent basis for opposition to a liberal order. We were shocked when we were attacked by Islamic fundamentalists, but they were attacking not just out of anti-colonial resentment, but in defense of a proposition about where the authority of government and where the authority for the governance of daily life comes from. I could go on in this vein. In conclusion, there is an attack not only on liberal principles, but also on what I'll call liberal sociology. the liberal way of life. And it's one to think through. We liberals favor peace. Many anti-liberals see virtues in conflict and in war. We accept and even laud heterogeneity. But in many quarters, there's a longing for homogeneity. We applaud dynamism. But dynamism and the desire of many people for stability don't coexist very easily. We cherish the ability to challenge authority. But many people experience challenges to authority as sources of instability. They want authority, even if that authority cannot fully justify itself before the bar of reason. We fear tyranny. They want leaders who can act boldly. I could go on in this vein, but whether you're talking about liberal principles or liberal sociology, there's another side of the argument that we will be disarmed to fight unless we take it on board and think it through.
David, in addition to taking this as a point of departure to where you want to go, I want to start with a prompt to you about novelty, because you were in a position to see changes happening in very real time in 2014, 15, 16, before some of the launches into taking over the Claremont Review of Books or publishing books, or you were seeing, particularly this younger audience we're talking about, working out their complaint with you as the object of their demonology, but working out their complaint against you. That is, say, you saw something new happening. Was the something new intellectually or morally significant? Is there, I want to kind of use you to potentially push back on the idea of mere permanence here. Is there something new going on?
I think that the something new that's going on was that, as Bill was saying, there was, and Mark's saying, talking about the smell of the rain. I remember do you remember when Occupy Wall Street got going? And a lot of it was really incoherent. People took over a plot of ground and were there, and why? I mean, and the one sign that I saw that summed it all up, and I'm going to censor my words, was crap is all effed up and crap. That was a sign. Like, stuff's going bad, right? So things are not going, and this was, post Great Recession, still, you're still in Iraq. There is a lot of discontent. And I think that one of the things that happened, particularly on the right, is you had this sense of discontent. You had this sense that things had not been working. And a lot of the post-liberals on the right came in and they had a full spectrum explanation for this that went well beyond politics. And if you're wanting to talk about young men in particular, really scratched where they were itching about something is wrong in this country about what it means to be a man. And that before anyone was talking about this in elite circles, it was very apparent that we were already into a crisis of masculinity. The deaths of despair, which disproportionately hit single men, were already rising, single and divorced men. We were already seeing this. We were seeing men falling behind in school to women. We were seeing widespread prescriptions of medication just being handed out to young men who were in many ways often just kind of going through what young boys do. Like a middle school boy, like me as an 8th grade boy, I could present as a troubled person just by being an 8th grader. And so you actually had a lot of negative things occurring at the same time that many of the institutions, these sort of thick institutions that had been present in our lives, were beginning to crumble and fray. So this is a few years after Bowling Alone, which I think is one of the more prescient and important books I've ever read about the effects of social isolation and atomization. And so all of this is kind of coming together at once. into, and again, focusing in on young men, because NatCon crowd is a very young man focused crowd. And so all of this is happening. There's the smell of the rain, there's a deep discontent, and in comes sort of the post-liberals. And one thing that I think is important to understand about the post-liberals, it's not just an intellectual movement, it's also an aesthetic movement. It's a lifestyle, it's a culture. And so in many ways, it came in with a great explanation, which was, let me just sort of run through it in the most basic way. The explanation is, as soon as a society adopts liberal democracy and the principles of liberal democracy fully, it's essentially, in essence, as if you started the ticking of the doomsday clock. Because what liberalism does is it degrades the pre-liberal institutions, family, church, etc., that are necessary for human flourishing. And that what liberalism ultimately does is it starts a process of decay and degrading. And that what liberal defenders of liberal democracy would say is a healthy testing. In other words, no institution in liberalism gets off scot-free. Nobody gets to live the unexamined life in liberalism. So if you're part of a big religious institution, you're going to be questioned. You're going to face questioning, and you're going to face critique. And some institutions don't do well in the face of that. Some do better than others. But they began to see the degradation of institutions. They grew up in an era of atomization and isolation. They're in many ways the products of the play-free childhood. And what's one of the consequences of the play-free childhood? So this is what Jonathan Haidt talks about, for example. And one of the consequences of that is when I was a young Gen Xer, the best generation, when I was a young Gen Xer, I was a latchkey kid. And so for some of us, that was fine. And for a lot of us, it was really not fine at all. For me, it was fine. I'm such a nerd that I took advantage of my unlimited freedom as a middle schooler to organize a neighborhood chess tournament. But that's not everybody's latchkey experience. And so my generation of parents and younger boomer parents said, our kids are not going to do that. And it's very interesting. We have declining birth rates in this country, but we have an increasing amount of time that parents spend with their children, which kind of disrupts the parental selfishness thesis. But what we said is, this is not going to happen to my kids. And so what we began to do was to create the incredibly managed childhood, super managed childhood. And so whereas we would work out disputes ourselves, I'd come home, I'd have a black eye. My dad would say, "What happened?" "Nothing." "Wait, what?" "And don't worry about it." We worked things out. Well, you now have a situation where kids are growing up with highly managed childhoods, which teaches them in the event of conflict to do what? Appeal to authority. Constantly in conflict, appeal to authority, appeal to authority, appeal to authority. And so in 2015, Greg Lukianoff at FIRE began to notice that the demands for censorship and suppression in higher education were not as much coming from the top down anymore. When I started doing my free speech work on college campuses, 99% of the time, the censorship and the speech codes were a top-down imposition. What we began to see beginning in 2015, 2014, 2015 was a lot of the demands for censorship were now coming from the grassroots up. These were kids coming in at 18, 19 years old, already in many ways fully post-liberal, both left and right, saying, "I don't feel good about this situation. Authority, fix it. You have to fix it." And so you have to fix it, this appeal to authority, mixed with the genuine sense of the law of isolation, atomization. It is no accident that people who are more lonely, who feel less of a sense of belonging, are drawn to these post-liberal movements. And so you have an explanation. Here's why things are bad. Liberalism has been degrading all of this. And here's what's better. Authority that, by the way, you've spent your entire childhood being trained to appeal to when things are a matter of distress. Authority is the issue, but is the answer, but we cannot overlook the aesthetic. Because it's not just that they said to liberalism, intellectually liberalism is degrading the things that you love. They also turned to liberalism and said, they're a bunch of weak, unmasculine people. You know, post-liberalism drives a four-wheel drive. Post-liberalism you've got some guns. Post-liberalism gets in the weight room. There's a whole aesthetic to this, and that the liberals are all, not to pick on him if he's here, maybe, but the pajama boy guy from the Obama era. That's what that's what liberals are. And so it began to create this really binary choice between strength and weakness, between order and chaos, and then actually between affection, post-liberals like young men, and animosity. The liberal establishment hates masculinity. And so that began to create a powerful pull for young men. And the answer to that pull is not to denigrate some of the values that some of these young men really value, that are actually good. So, for example, there is nothing, in my view, inconsistent between liberalism and a devout religious faith. But what the post-liberals will say is that liberalism inherently denigrates your faith. I would say there's nothing inconsistent between liberalism and a devout religious faith. There's nothing inconsistent between liberalism and martial courage or physical valor. And one of the best illustrations of that is the conflict right now between Russia and Ukraine. Russia, the forces of religious authoritarianism, don't underestimate the religious element of this, and Ukraine, on its way towards integration with the EU and liberal democracy, and who is demonstrating tremendous martial valor right now, just tremendous. And so I think we have to have an answer that does not concede to post-liberals things that are good, such as courage, such as what it means to be a virtuous masculine man, such as devout religious faith, and instead say that liberalism is in many ways the ideal home for all of these virtues. Where do we need martial courage in the defense against authoritarianism? Where does religion truly thrive? It is not within authoritarianism, it is within liberalism. And where can you as a young man actually find your way in a robust way in a free market, in an enterprise, in a free market that rewards risk-taking and entrepreneurialism? And so we have to be able to reach these young men in the virtuous values and teach them that the virtuous values that they're seeking find a home and a place in liberalism.
Mark has something he wanted to say.
Yeah, it suddenly occurred to me in listening both to Bill and David in relation to what I was saying that, and I'm just trying to throw a monkey wrench into even my own thinking here, that maybe it's precisely the felt need to provide answers to the post-liberal questions that is our problem, because it assumes that liberalism is a thing, right? And that therefore this thing has to provide everything. It doesn't. And you're walking into their trap if you are cowered into thinking that you need an account of the whole. And the reason it's a whole, it's not simply that the post-liberals think that it just came as a whole. They think that it's because of the nature of liberalism, it's a rash. And every institution within society catches this rash and no longer is able to do what it does because it's got all these other problems and it's scratching all the time. I'm wondering whether we should resist the attempt to respond and write books about liberalism as a way of life, when in some sense it is. Say, no, liberalism is liberalism, you get a life. Mm-hmm. That liberalism is liberalism, and valor is another thing. It's neither liberal nor not liberal. And so we can address these other things, but resist the need to respond in kind because we're ceding something that we shouldn't cede. That liberalism is a whole, it's the product of some kind of history, and it's an apocalyptic history. So fight back.
I like that a lot, because I think that what we're talking about is, when I talk to young men and I talk about sort of, traditionally masculine virtues, strength, physical courage, things like that, I was initially totally stumped as to what this has to do with liberalism.
Yeah.
Right? Totally stumped. I mean, throughout my entire history coming up as a Reagan conservative, the idea that there would be something inconsistent between defense of liberal democracy and like physical courage, what? Like, to me, the two went hand in hand, that these things went hand in hand. And so one of the, you're exactly right that they have looked at folks who have a lot of felt need and have created this overwhelming boogeyman. That liberalism is why you feel bad. It's why you feel bad. And we have to resist the urge to say, no, liberalism can make you feel good. And instead say, no. There is a complete misconception you're operating under as to what liberalism is doing and what liberalism is. And one of the big misconceptions, this is very powerful in post-liberal Christianity, is the equation between liberalism and moral relativism. That liberalism is a version of moral relativism. It is not. It is not. It is one of the only ways we figured out as human beings for people who hold very different worldviews to live together while continuing to hold and advance their very different worldviews. Liberalism is not about flattening all of our differences. It is instead about how do you maintain your differences and maintain a community. But that message that liberalism is moral relativism has penetrated very deeply into particularly post-liberal Christianity.
But there's another way of putting this challenge. It's not exactly a radical innovation to suggest that liberalism has pretty close to its core a distinction between what's public and what's private. And it's that distinction that allows for the peaceful coexistence of difference. But that distinction between the public and the private runs up against a desire that many people have for wholeness, right? And so if you look at the Catholic integralists, for example, their argument is that that you can't really live a good life unless the public and private are merged under a single doctrine. Another way of putting this is that liberalism is a kind of modus vivendi among differences. But some people ask themselves, why should I coexist with what I believe to be false and evil? Why is tolerance of difference so good? And the classic answer to that question is that the alternative to the tolerance of difference is bloody conflict. And there are some people who are not going to take that as a knockdown argument against
Right.
engaging in that conflict.
Yep.
And so, at every step along the way, at least I at least see something deep going on, and that is that liberalism represents a fundamental set of choices. I believe that they're defensible choices, but as a Berlinian pluralist, I have to acknowledge the fact that there are genuine goods that lie outside of the circle of choices that liberalism has made. I don't see any way around that, which tells me that anti-liberalism is coeval with liberalism and will endure as long as liberalism does.
There are big public liberal and liberal constitutional systems that we tend to focus on when we talk about the crisis of liberal politics or liberal orders in the world. The breakdown in democratic contestation and liberal constitutionalism, the rise of one-party or semi-one-party autocratic systems, and the gradual crumbling of the post-war consensus on free trade and liberal economics. But then there's the things that draw people into their support for anti-liberal parties. And we've now been touching on two of them, sometimes in a way that is only about the US, but the issues are not only US ones. And I'd identify them as a mixture of, on the one hand, discourses about global migration, about race, about civilizations and civilizational distinctions, and about religion as a component of civilizationalism. Paradigmatically here, we might think about Alexander Dugin and the story that he has told to Russia about Russia's place in the New World Order, but with lots of echoes around the world. And on the other hand, overlapping, especially through the vehicle of talking about religion, gender and sexuality and the politics and shared social orders around gender and sexuality. There's a really striking global recurring pattern in the ways that gender and sexuality and the coexistence of ways of living gender and sexuality is talked about in post-liberalism, from Florida to Hungary expelling the CEU on the grounds that it had a gender studies department, to Russia and the obsession with characterizing the decadent West primarily through accounts of the Western model of gender and sexuality, to, in different ways, India. Those are maybe developed arguments, and in Catholic integralism, which is not only a US phenomenon, but is increasingly a fact in Catholicism worldwide. They are maybe well-developed arguments. They are maybe mere defenses of habitual ways of holding or wielding power. They are maybe toxic combinations of those things. Is there a bridge? We see an attempted bridge in some of the post-liberal theorists, from Dugin to Deneen, between talking about those big institutions on one hand. The world of free markets was a world of free migration. The world of free migration is a world of civilizational decadence because there are, the discourse in very many places is there are too many Muslims showing up in, whether it be in Russia or in India or in the United States. That civilizational decadence then somehow becomes also an account of a loss of gender hierarchy or loss of traditional patterns of sexuality, or loss of traditional patterns of marriage. There's an attempt to connect those dots. Is there anything to that connection? And if so, does it get us anywhere toward the crisis of actual public liberal representative constitutional democracy, which seems to be the outcome? We get this toxic politics mixing together race and religion and civilization and sexuality, and then the outcome is autocracy. How do we get from one to the other? David, you look like you're...
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up this issue, because I think that we have two things happening at once. One, my colleague Ross Douthat uses this really great phrase to describe sort of pre-civil rights America, movement America was dominated by a soft white Protestant establishment. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And there's no question that white Protestant establishment has diminished in its power and authority. And for good reasons, for good reasons. And that's a good thing. But if you are in the white Protestant establishment, you're going to experience even a justified loss of power as a loss. You will experience that as a loss. And a lot of times you're not going to have a historical perspective on that actually that loss is necessary if we're going to actually have a truly pluralistic liberal democracy. The white Protestant establishment was actively unjust in many ways. So they're going to experience that as a loss, and that is going to create its own tension. But let's also not forget that there's a giant blind spot I've found left of center in talking about race, gender, and sexuality. And that is, a lot of times everyone on the center left sort of thinks about the movement for greater equality in areas of race, gender, and sexuality as being an entirely virtuous movement. And a lot of it has been very, very virtuous. But some of it, particularly on campuses, has been very hostile and illiberal itself. And so it is kind of a little rich to a lot of young right post-liberals to hear all of a sudden everyone rising up left of center saying, we've got a post-liberalism problem, when they're like, I just graduated from a school with a speech code. Okay, I just graduated from a school where if I raised, even in the most kind way, an objection to, say, a biological male competing against biological females in athletics, that I could probably face sanctioned punishment and certainly massive social exclusion. And then to hear that same sort of wing of people saying, defend liberalism, they're like, what are we talking about here? And so I think that there is a real issue that is totally genuine of people angry that they have lost disproportionate power that they shouldn't have had. And there is also a real issue created by left illiberalism that, especially for folks who live in deep blue spaces, that talk to some of them about their lives and what it's been like for them. And then they're going to be open to somebody who says, all of that was inflicted upon you, only I can protect you. Only I can protect you. And I think that if you can't combat left illiberalism and you're left of center, ultimately you're going to be part of the problem.
Bill and Mark, it's time for us to move to Q&A. Can you hold on to the thoughts that you have probably already formulated? Okay, the floor is open for questions. Right next to the microphone, right? Yes. Please introduce yourself and say your institution. It is not on.
Okay, my name is Adam Jesdal. I'm affiliated with the Heterodox Academy. I'm trained as a political philosopher, so I'm approaching this using I'll pose my question using some Rawlsian jargon. So there was briefly, David French mentioned that, liberalism is one thing, and then religion, military valor, those are all other things. But my understanding is that at least part of the post-liberal critique from Catholic integralism is that liberalism is one thing, and it's led to the degradation or corruption of Catholicism. So a lot of Catholic integralists think that Vatican II, which resulted in the endorsing liberal toleration, that was the wrong direction for the church to take. So, my question is, there's still a defense of liberalism, not as an object of overlapping consensus, because these private doctrines maybe have to be corrupted or changed in order to accommodate liberal values. But there's still this idea of liberalism as a modus vivendi, where it's this technology for maintaining peace. And I was wondering if you think that at least some of the post-liberal ideas today, like Catholic integralism, if when people realize that actually implementing Catholic integralist ideas would undermine liberalism as a modus vivendi, are people going to accept that gives them bad reasons to be Catholic integralists, that it will undermine these conditions for harmonious living?
I think this is a Bill question. Yeah.
As an empirical matter, the answer to your question is no. They will not regard that as an adequate response. And one way of looking at this question historically, is to ask how much of the famous 19th century syllabus of errors, would Catholic integralists accept? My hunch is almost all of it, right? And that is the distillation of Catholic anti-liberalism drawn from authentic sources of Catholicism. It's also historically undeniable, that it was an American, a thoroughly Americanized American Catholic, John Courtney Murray, and his troops who brought these ideas of tolerance into the Catholic Church. Was it a plot, an American plot to undermine Catholicism? Absolutely not. It was an effort by, thoughtful Catholics to take the best of the American tradition and bring it into Catholicism in a way that was not inauthentic. But there has been resistance to that move ever since, and the integralists, who don't represent a very large political movement, let us say, have their own reasons for rejecting, the history of the Catholic Church over the past 70 years.
Over here.
Trip myself up before I ask the question. Anne Marie Slaughter from New America. So, and I should just say I wasn't here yesterday, so if my question touches on that, I'm so sorry. But this was fascinating. And I want to start by saying how much I agree with David French. I've often described myself as a feminist by day and a very worried mother of 2 boys by night. And indeed, John Haidt and I are now co-chairing the advisory group of the new Institute for Boys and Men that Richard Reeves is running. I mean, there's a very serious problem here. And David, particularly for my older son, he doesn't know how to be a good, virtuous man. If he's too protective, he's patronizing. I won't rehearse it. But I absolutely think this is a huge piece of it. At the same time, when you said neocon circles are male, I just looked around the room. I haven't been in this male environment for a very long time. And that may be a good thing, because we need conversations that where my sons, I'll just say, would feel free to say what they think, which was not true on liberal campuses, even mine, Princeton, many others. But Bill, when you said, talked about the public-private distinction and where that was coming from, I'm thinking, wait a minute, feminists nailed the public-private distinction because it allowed domestic abuse and countless other things. I mean, that was the origin of feminism in the 70s, was to undo that description so that there was room for us in liberalism. And what really is striking to me about your conversation is that I don't hear room for liberal women who are liberals. I count myself as a liberal, but there was no place for us. And when we talk about those institutions, church and family, those were patriarchal institutions. You have to undo the patriarchy in those institutions so that there's room for half the population. So it's not a question exactly, I hope it's not a rant, I hope it's reasoned, but it does seem to me that so much of what you're describing, and really in terms of your very good opening question, what is the connection between what's happening in the world and the crisis of liberal politics? A lot of it, I think, has been feminism trying to make room, becoming too extreme in some cases, but then not finding liberal support for, building an infrastructure of care, which, if you're a woman, is every bit as much a part of infrastructure as anything else. And yet that was dismissed on the left as well as the right. So I'm just making an appeal to try to take account of a feminist perspective that is not a radical perspective at all. Indeed, it's a liberal perspective based on a whole vision of human nature that is both caring and competitive, that is whole, but not necessarily in the Catholic integralist model. Thank you.
Does anyone want to? There was not necessarily a need. The intervention is, I think, highly appreciated. Does anyone want to say anything in response?
I'll be happy to.
Okay.
To say that liberalism encodes a distinction between the public and the private is not to say that the boundary is uncontested or that it should be uncontested. And, I think you're aware, Anne Marie, that, I would be among the last people to defend the old order. Fair enough. But the alternative to some distinction between the public and the private is totalism. The total dominance of the public over the private. There's a long history of regimes that have behaved in that fashion. And I can assure you that neither you nor I would find a comfortable place in such regimes. I mean, you're an expert on international relations, and you know what I'm talking about. And so I don't think it's entirely fair to say that if liberalism involves in principle a distinction between the public and the private, that the person articulating that view is necessarily opposed to or even blind and deaf to the legitimate and long overdue claims of feminism. But at the same time, and this gets back to some of the things that David was talking about on college campuses. If we don't acknowledge the fact that there have been excesses in the name of this cause, as in all other causes, then we are simply inviting the empowerment of the side that we both oppose. And, I don't know how to put it any better than that, so I'm simply going to stop.
Okay. Yes.
Thank you all for a great discussion. Matt Kukum, Institute for Humane Studies. I want to draw a connection potentially between two different threads. I believe Will Galston said that liberalism is going to be judged by potentially its lack of fruit. And David French went on to describe a number of different modern malaises, if we want to use that term. I wonder if there's a connection. Even if we might reject Deneen's formulation that liberalism is a wholesale failure, is it possible that liberalism, some intrinsic thread within liberalism, has led to some of the challenges that David has identified, and perhaps that we could, perhaps others that we could add to that list? Thank you.
Let me take a shot at that real fast. So I think that there is, in one ways, liberalism creates the conditions that places itself in a temporary inherent disadvantage against authoritarianism. And so what I mean by that is liberalism, by its very nature, is open to self-critique. All of the institutions, as I was saying earlier, all of the institutions in a truly free liberal democratic society, there is not an institution that's going to be insulated from critique. And so part of the lifeblood of liberal democratic society is that we're actually arguing a lot, and we're constantly surfacing our problems, just constantly surfacing our problems. And that's good overall. Overall, that's good, but it also carries with it a danger. And the danger is that when we're constantly surfacing our problems, we're often at the same time minimizing our virtues. Mm-hmm. And so that we're always and forever, my whole life, we've been in the hardest time in American history. And so we're constantly, and then the more authoritarian structures very much, they conceal and they minimize all of their problems and erect this, Potemkin village version of themselves. When you go to the DMZ at Korea, you'll see some of these villages. They look beautiful, and there's literally nothing behind them. And so if you're an American post-liberal, you are constantly marinating in news about our problems. My friend and dispatch colleague, Jonah Goldberg, just had a debate with Neil Ferguson about whether America is right now is in late Soviet stage, right? And people are actually debating that. I thought Jonah did a phenomenal job rebutting that. But we're always surfacing our problems, and the authoritarian cultures are always minimizing theirs. And then there are moments when the clash occurs, and the mask falls, and you see the true nature of authoritarianism. And it actually was more weak, more corrupt, more hollowed out than the liberal society that has cast itself as weak and often corrupt and hollowed out as part of our natural give and take of our discourse. And, you know, again, I go back to that Russia-Ukraine clash where so much of Russia was sort of revealed. And I mentioned Russia intentionally because a lot of the post-liberals on the right have admired it. So much was revealed as rotten and weak compared to the image. And so we're always surfacing our problems, which is good, but we should also surface our virtues, and there are many. And by surfacing our virtues, I think we can begin to inspire people again rather than just constantly frightening them.
You wanted to add a word?
Yeah. I am going to be an anti-liberal. Robert Frost famously defined a liberal as someone who couldn't take his own side in an argument. And Mark illustrated that perfectly, when he, threw a monkey wrench into his own argument a few minutes ago. The point of departure for theoretical post-liberalism, namely that liberalism has failed, is preposterous. By what standard has liberalism failed? It is the most successful form of government possible under modern circumstances. And it will continue to be that. I'm absolutely certain of that. And it's absolutely true, as David said, that under circumstances of freedom, there will be constant contestation, the development of difference, and the constant airing of problems. Does that mean that we're failing? By what standard? Right? What form of government has ever done better? So, as we air all of the theoretical problems, we should hold fast to a practical truth, namely that what we're defending is not just ours, although it is ours, and we should defend it, or at least be sympathetic to it for that reason. We're defending it because there is no superior alternative, and everything else is much, much worse.
I've used the Frost as a paper prompt with students to good effect after they've spent some time working on the problematic relationship between liberal public institutions that are meant to be frameworks for coexistence across kinds of disagreements, the kind of procedures that David in particular has been talking about, and the idea that there's a substantive ethos or way of life or set of commitments about how to live freely in the space of dynamism and change. And I find it a good paper prompt because it's something that I think doesn't admit of clear settlement. There needs to be something of both. Mark, you had something you wanted to add too.
Yeah, I feel like there's been a bit of backsliding since the moment of revelation when I first spoke. Already, see, this is what happens with revelations. And that is that I think we're backsliding into trying to explain that liberalism can offer answers to eternal human problems. It cannot. It is a way of being able to come to answers or attempts at answers in a social context without domination, right? And so if there's a problem in the family, that has to be addressed. If our children are floating, especially our young men, we should address that. There are all sorts of problems we can address, but we don't have to say that it's the liberal idea that provides the solution, right? I do not look to the manual that comes with my electric toaster looking for what to do when my car won't start. right? It's a different manual. And there are lots of manuals for different problems we have. You know, as I said in the piece I just had in the New York Review, if you're worried about spiritual emptiness of young people, preach the gospel. Don't try to take over the education department. Preach the gospel. Or at the very least, go to a baseball game and hold up a sign that says John 3:3. I mean, just do your bit.
Yeah.
Right? But Anne-Marie's question does require an answer about liberalism, I feel. And it's an important question she asked. And it helps us to see that one of the advances in American, well, even European liberalism since World War II had been an attentiveness to the idea that there are certain social conditions that are required to fully participate as a liberal citizen. If you want a liberal order, you cannot be putting various handcuffs on people and other sorts of things that prevent them from participating in the liberal order. And so if you have a strong account of liberal citizenship, you then can derive from that, and must derive from that, a sense of what changes might be needed socially so that that system can operate as it's intended to.
Right here, yes.
Hi, I didn't think you would actually choose me. Let me gather my thoughts for a moment. I'm Robin. I'm a upcoming student at George Mason University. I'm taking econ. So, as a young person, I am extremely terminally online. I was wondering if you have any thoughts on the role that online personas are playing in the marketplace of ideas, because I think the landscape is changing a lot. Like right now, what I see is in a lot of post-liberalism and like the rise of post-liberal critique are like online streamers such as Nick Fuentes, or the new ideology called MAGA communism led by Haz Aldin. And I think they are playing a huge role in changing public discourse and also in shaping, especially instrumental in shaping communities and helping this movements organize. And I noticed that the more mainstream institutions are not really recognizing them or responding to them, even though I know responding to them is always a bit of a trap, but I think this construction is still really important. So I was wondering if you have any thoughts of this more online movement.
I think this is David.
Oh man, I'm so glad you raised that question. So I was about to say this is the dumbest thing in social media discourse, but this is probably like the 15th dumbest thing in social media discourse. But one of the dumbest things we see in social media discourse is the furious anger at my publication, the New York Times, that if only we can get the headlines right, like democracy will be saved and Trump is going to lose, because it's totally all of this laser focus, for example, on legacy media outlets is just missing the boat. If we're looking at where people are getting their information and where people are molding and shaping so many of their political ideas, it genuinely is TikTok, and which has led me to think, what is the liberalism dance that I can do, like on TikTok, to really pop? I'm still working it out, but you'll know it when it happens. But that is not it. That is not it. But we do have to understand that we have to be able to meet people where they are. This is Persuasion 101. Mm-hmm. Meet people where they are, both from a matter of understanding their values and also understanding the platforms in which they're talking and communicating. And I have to say that, the defenders of liberal democracy and the defenders of liberalism have not been so great at that. We really haven't. And that the critics of liberalism have so far been much better. And that's out of my skill set. Like it's out of my skill set to be some sort of social media, some sort of social media influencer. But there is no question that we can't just decry the influence of social media. We have to enter into this conversation where people live. Because guess what? We can decry social media all day long, and no one hears it who's on social media. And so learning where people are, not just where they stand, but where they sit, where they get their information, and entering into that is I think, absolutely necessary, which is why Bernie's so invaluable. He is an epic tweeter. He is an incredible tweeter.
You are absolutely an influencer. Sherry Berman.
Hi, thank you very much.
Wait for the microphone.
Sorry. Hi, thank you very much for these comments. I wanted to pick up on some of the things that other folks have brought up, which is namely that there are legitimate critiques of what liberalism became by the early 21st century that I think you haven't fully addressed. So David, for instance, said, oh, Occupy had all of these incoherent placards. Well, sure they did, but there was obviously a critique there. It was a critique that the economic aspects of liberalism had gotten out of control, creating a financial crisis and all kinds of problems for, the average person. Anne-Marie brought up this question about critiques of the sort of political part of liberalism that said, look, we had women and minorities that were shut out of the liberal order for too long. And those critiques then went on to, sort of degenerate, as some people have argued, into sort of narratives of individualism that went, too far, that pushed back against the community institutions and the networks that keep our societies together. So I guess my question is, how much should true liberals be worried just about post-liberal critiques? Those are real and important. And how much should they be focused on the ways in which liberalism began to fail by the end of the 20th century, creating excesses, so to speak, that gave these post-liberals rooms for their critiques to flourish?
Mark, this is where does the weather pattern come from in part?
Well, no, I'm not sure. I would again just push back at the idea that that liberalism failed. That sounds a little bit like liberalism is this whole, right? Except when it comes to economics. I guess my response to you would be like the response to Anne-Marie, and that is that it's clear to me, and as I wrote in my last book, The Once and Future Liberal, that not only are there ways in which structure of the family and law regarding the family kept women from fully participating as citizens, so the new neoliberal order in which we live does the same thing. It disenfranchises people from being able to participate as citizens, right? And so what if people are participating, then the problem is simply fighting for justice in these various areas within the liberal system, but I don't blame liberalism for that. Liberalism, everything in our lives is not determined by liberalism. I mean, there are authoritarian countries that are participating in the new economic neoliberal order. It has nothing to do with liberalism, right? And so, again, it's going to come down to how we're using the term, I suppose. But I guess I'm just repeating myself. One is to what degree we have to look for areas in which we need to act in order that people be full liberal citizens. And the other is that other sorts of problems we address with the liberal system we have.
That is our timer, and the schedule is being arranged very tightly. So I'm afraid I'm going to have to call it there.